Welcome once again to the team. This is week 8 of our 24-week season. Took a little time to get going today to give a little extra time for shoe drop-off. Some guys are still out there helping Bob pack up, tabulate, and all that stuff. They'll take some photos, and we'll post those later this week. Thanks so much for those of you who participated in bringing shoes in today. I saw a big stack of them out there. They will count all those shoes, assign them to different tables if you mark them with your table number, and then we'll see, we'll let you know sometime during this coming week, which actually is a week off because we do not have team next week due to Thanksgiving, but we'll give you all the results. I'm so glad you're going to miss us here. But we'll all have some. That's actually a good point, but we'll all have sort of turkey hangover anyway next Friday morning. But we'll be off next Friday, but we'll send you the tabulations and the photos and all that. But thanks so much for participating. You'll see there's a little sheet on your table that Bob put together. He's saying that the official rules are that the table competition ends today with the shoes brought in today. But if you have extras that you didn't think about, maybe you forgot, you left them in your garage or whatever, you can just give Bob a call. We'll find a way to either bring them here on some Friday morning or get them to him some way, but they won't go to your table count. And Bob did tell me the first guy that showed up today was from table 22 who won last year. So they were serious about this thing. So we'll see what happens. All right. I don't know how many that one guy brought in. No, Bob didn't tell me, so I don't know. I know no numbers. You can't get them from me. We'll send them to you this week. So
my labels blew up.
Dog ate my homework, right? Yeah. All right, here's the story for today. A duck walks into a bar. You guys know this one? Sits down at the bar and asks the bartender, "Got any grapes?" The bartender's confused, not because of the duck, oddly enough, but because the duck asked for grapes. He says, "No, we don't serve grapes here." The duck thanks him and leaves. Next day, duck comes back, sits at the bar and asks the bartender, "Got any grapes?" This time the bartender's a little annoyed. He says, "No, this bar does not serve grapes, has never served grapes, and furthermore will never serve grapes." Duck thanks him very politely and leaves. The third day, the duck returns again. But before he can say anything, the bartender yells, "Listen, duck, this is a bar. We do not serve grapes. If you ask for grapes one more time, I'm going to nail your stupid duck beak to the bar." The duck's silent for a moment, then asks, "Got any nails?" Confused, the bartender says, "No." He says, "Good. Got any grapes?" Now that's like an ultimate dad joke, I know that, but there's a reason tell that story today because our session title, if you notice, is called Remember the Grapes. Now I'm going to get into that in a little more detail after we look at our movie clip today. We're once again hearing from our patriarch of the team ministry, William Wallace, in the movie Braveheart, so check out this clip.
I knight thee, Sir William Wallace. Sir William, in the name of God, we declare and appoint thee guardian and high protector of Scotland, and thy captains as aide-de-camp. Stand and be recognized.
Does anyone know his politics?
No, but his weight with the commoners could unbalance everything. Belios will kiss his ass, and so we must.
Sir William! Sir William, inasmuch as you and your captains hail from a region long known to support the Balliol clan, may we invite you to continue your support and uphold our rightful claim?
Damn the Balliol clan! They're all longshanks!
Gentlemen! Now is the time to declare a king.
Oh, wait! Then you're prepared to recognize our legitimate succession, are you?
You're the ones who won't support the rightful claim.
Those were lies when you first wrote them. That's true.
I demand recognition of these documents.
These documents were lies when you wrote them.
We have beaten the English, but they'll come back.
Because you won't stand together.
Well, what will you do?
I will invade England and defeat the English on their own ground.
Invade? That's impossible.
Why? Why is that impossible? You're so concerned with squabbling for the scraps from Longshank's table that you've missed your God-given right to something better. There's a difference between us. You think the people of this country exist to provide you with position. I think your position exists to provide those people with freedom. And I go to make sure that they have it.
Okay, the line there that I want to focus on, actually two lines. One is, you won't stand together. We'll come back to that right at the end today. But when he says, you're so concerned squabbling for the scraps from Longshank's table, you've missed your God-given right to something better. There's kind of a parallel to this place we're going to be in the Old Testament today. Last week, Jeff taught on the succession between Moses and the younger leader Joshua, and he taught you the ancient war cry, right? Do you still remember it? Rock Kazakh, right? And I'd never heard that before quite like that. And Jeff and I were talking about it. I said, you got to do that. That should be like the team war cry. It should have been all these years because it really captures what we want to be all about. Be strong and of good courage and stand together. Now today, we're going to go backwards just a bit in the great story of the narrative of Israel, kind of a prequel to what Jeff did last week. The story we're going to pick up today, Moses is still the leader of the people of Israel. They've escaped Egypt in the Exodus, and they're on their way to what is called the Promised Land, the land of Canaan. Joshua is still a young man at this point. He hasn't taken over yet. And Caleb, Joshua's sidekick buddy, is mentioned for the first time. Moses then decides to send out a scout team, what the Bible calls spies, into the land of Canaan, just to do some reconnaissance work to check out before they actually move into the land. All right? So we're in the book of Numbers, as I'm sure you haven't read recently in your private devotions. Numbers chapter 13. And I'm going to break this story up. It's a little longer narrative. I'll break it up a little bit and we'll talk about it. When Moses sent them to explore Canaan, he said, go up through the Negev and on into the hill country. Now that's significant. It means the land of Canaan was at an elevation. And as any military guy knows, if you want to go into battle, you'd rather not fight uphill against a fortified enemy. But this is a hill country that God has promised them. See what the land is like, and whether the people who live there are strong or weak, few or many. What kind of land do they live in? Is it good or bad? What kinds of towns do they live in? Are they unwalled or fortified? How is the soil? Is it fertile or poor? Are there trees in it or not? Do your best to bring back some of the fruit of the land. And then in parentheses, it was the season for the first ripe grapes. And that's a hint to where we're going in the story. Verse 21, so they went up and explored the land from the desert of Zin as far as Rehob to the Lebo Hamath, and they went up through the Negev and came to Hebron. And by the way, when you read the Old Testament, you see all these places and names and mountains. They're all given specific names. That is because this narrative history of Israel took place in real time in real places, and it's as if God is leaving breadcrumbs for modern-day historians and archaeologists to go back and find out, did this stuff really happen? Real places, real time, it's a real story, it's not make-believe. Okay, where Heman and Sheshai and Talmai, the descendants of Anak, lived. Hebron had been built 7 years before Zoan in Egypt. Now let me pause there. So they're moving toward the promised land of Canaan in a region that we would today call the Sinai Peninsula and southern Israel. So we're kind of between Egypt and Israel on the map. And then he mentions the descendants of a guy named Anak. And this is really an interesting and mysterious little historical detail. Anak, the word itself, the name, means long-necked or very tall. And he's mentioned earlier in the Old Testament as a great warrior. His descendants are called the Anakim. Not Anakin, like in Skywalker, but Anakim with an N on the end. And the Anakim were known to be people of unusual size, warlike, large human beings. The Hebrew people believed that the Anakim were descended from what are called the Nephilim, which were this mysterious and terrifying people who lived in the pre-flood days in the Old Testament. And some scholars believe actually that Goliath, in the famous story of David and Goliath, descended from the Anakim people group. Okay, so that's the background of the story. That's why they mentioned this particular group, because it was terrifying. The really large, scary people that were warriors. So the story begins here with what I'm calling a shared willingness to serve. All right, shared willingness to serve, and I'll explain. You remember the old Mission Impossible TV show? I mean, not the Tom Cruise version now in the movies, but the old Peter Graves version of the TV show. At least that's my era. Maybe I'm older than you. But it would start, every single week would start the same way. You'd hear the theme song, then you'd hear, your mission, Jim, should you decide to accept it, is, and it'd be like blah, 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 save the world from some evil guy planning to destroy the planet. As usual, should you or any member of your IM force be captured or killed, the secretary will disavow any knowledge of your existence. This tape will self-destruct in 5 seconds. Good luck, Jim. Now, here's the situation. The people have escaped Egypt in the Exodus. They're moving through the desert on their way to the land that God has promised them, the promised land. Now they're right on the brink. They're right on the edge of that land. They can see it. They can see the hill country, but the land is inhabited. And the inhabitants of that land are probably not going to welcome a group of 1 million or more political refugees from Egypt, which is what they were. They've been in bondage for 400 years. Now they've escaped the whole nation, and they're on the brink of this land. So Moses decides to send in some spies, 12 spies, on a scout team to check it out. Joshua and Caleb are 2 of those 12. So what we know of these 2 young men at this point in time is that they shared a willingness to serve. Now, we don't know whether they volunteered, pick me, or whether they were sort of drafted, whether Moses, the great man of God, chose them specifically for the task. But it seems that Moses knew of them, and maybe they had already demonstrated courage and valor, Rak Kazak. Maybe they had already demonstrated that in their lives, but they're chosen to be in this team of 12. So they're going behind enemy lines to gather information, and if the rumor is true, if what they believed was true, the region is inhabited by very large, warlike people. So it reads kind of like the beginning of a war movie, right? It would be like The Dirty Dozen, or like I know. We call it Rak Kazak, God's Dirty Dozen. That would work, right? We could write a movie scene about this. So if they're successful, Moses, the leader, gets information that helps him plan his battle as they're going to take this land. If they fail, they're all going to be slaughtered by this people group who doesn't want them coming into their land. Joshua and Caleb, both willing to do a hard job, a dangerous job, so they're willing to serve. The second thing we see is they share a hunger for blessing. They share a hunger for God's blessing. 15, 18 years ago, I was on the first team our church sent into Turkey. We have had and still have a vision to support Christian workers there and the establishment of new churches in a country that was once the place where the Apostle Paul founded some of the earliest Christian churches, a stronghold of Christ in the world. Today is 99.9% Muslim, mostly cultural Muslim, but it's Muslim. But we went there and we still send teams every year or so. And Turkey, as I learned, is a very, very interesting country. It's beautiful. It's very, very diverse culturally. Like if you're in Istanbul, all the way in the west, it's a giant cosmopolitan city like New York City or Paris. And then you can go to the ancient sites of the Christian movement, places like ancient Ephesus, places like Smyrna and Pergamon, where you see these unbelievable Roman ruins. Just incredible what civilization did 2,000-3,000 years ago, and where the church really took root and started. You can read that in the book of Acts in the New Testament, and all the way to the very eastern part of the country, which is very, very conservative. Women wear full black burqas, just holes for their eyes. Just a very diverse country. We also learned that Turkey is a very affluent country in many ways. One of the few countries in the world that actually exports food because of their productive agriculture business and technology. And my dad went on this trip with our church when we went that time, and we still tell this story. Just recently we remembered it and talked about it. We're all the way to the eastern region, staying in a small hotel, visiting a university and some work going on there. And in the morning, we were having breakfast or something, or tea, and we looked outside, and there was a farm cart going by this hotel. Just a random farm cart in this smaller town in the eastern part of Turkey. And we looked out, we go, what is that? What are those? And it was this cart, open cart, and we finally figured out they were cabbages. They were the biggest cabbages I'd ever seen. They were like bigger than basketballs, like beach ball sized cabbages on this cart, a mountain of them. They were like ginormous, like nuclear powered cabbages, and we have never forgotten the sight of these giant Turkish cabbages. And we see some of that in the story here. Verse 23, pick it up the story. When they reached the valley of Eshcol, they cut off a branch bearing a single cluster of grapes. 2 of them carried it on a pole between them, along with some pomegranates and figs. That place was called the Valley of Eshcol because the cluster of grapes the Israelites cut off there. The word Eshcol actually in Hebrew means cluster. And at the end of the 40 days, they returned from exploring the land. So the scout team goes off with their instructions. They bring back, among the things they bring back is a cluster of grapes so big it takes 2 grown men, 2 warriors to carry it back. Now, we need to know here the background story of grapes. Grapes were significant to them, not just because of their unusual size, the usual size of this cluster, but they were evidence that the land that God had promised to them was rich and fruitful. The grapes represented prosperity and hope for a prosperous life. More than that, much more important than that, is that grapes to the ancient Israelites symbolized the promise and blessing of God himself. Grapes were used to make wine, and wine was incredibly important to the people of that time. Wine was the symbol of God's presence and blessing. If you go all the way to the New Testament, Jesus began his earthly ministry with a miracle. Remember what the miracle was? Turning water into wine at a wedding feast, because wine was the symbol of God's blessing. And Jesus' presence indicated God is here now. And he ended his earthly ministry at the Last Supper when he poured a cup of wine, which was traditional at the Passover feast, and then transformed the meaning of that cup to his own blood shed for the forgiveness of the sins of the world. And we remember that today as Christians when we take communion, which is grape juice. We don't use wine in our tradition, we use grape juice. But the tradition of grapes, the significance of grapes goes all the way down through the Bible. So those grapes represented the presence and blessing of God himself. So they meant to Joshua and Caleb, those grapes meant that the land should be taken because God has promised it and his blessing is there. And that leads us to the third point we see in this ancient story, and that is that Joshua and Caleb both shared the courage to fight. They shared the willingness to serve, and they shared a hunger for God's blessing, and they shared the courage to fight, that rock kazakh that Jeff talked about last week. Years ago, I did a little coaching of basketball at a small college, Taylor University in Indiana, and it was just a small NAIA basketball school, but we had a chance to take a trip, two winters in a row, to California and played another Christian school out there, Biola University. And Biola, the first year we went out there, we actually surprised them and beat them on their own court, and they had been ranked in the nation and all that, but Taylor played a unique style and slowed the game down and beat them. So we went out the next year, and they were a little more ready for us. But the interesting thing about the next season, when we went out there, is Biola at that time, even though it was a small school, boasted the tallest basketball player in the world played for Biola that year. I don't know how they found him, how he got there, but his name was George Bell. You can look him up on the internet. George Bell, he was 7 feet 8 inches tall. And so there was no internet in those days. This is like 1980 80, 81, somewhere around in there. No internet, so we had heard about him, rumors about him. You didn't know much about him, never seen pictures of him, but we knew they had this guy that was 7 feet 8 inches tall. So we go out there, and we're preparing for this game. And my brother, who was playing for Taylor's team as a point guard, he's like 5'10", 5'11", he was in getting his ankles taped in the training room at Biola University. And when he was getting his ankles taped, he looked over and he saw a basketball sneaker sitting on a table. But it wasn't just any basketball sneaker. It was a size 22 high-top basketball sneaker. And he said it looked like one of those things hanging out in front of a shoe store to get you to come in. And he grabbed it, he looked around, and he ran into our locker room and said, "Hey guys, look." And the game was over right there. Because whoever fit into that shoe was going to play in the game. Now, they ended up beating us that day 67-30, okay? Mainly because they were mad about the year before. George Bell only played 11 minutes in the game. But still, the courage leaked right out of that room when my brother showed them that shoe. Continue the story, verse 26. They, the 12 scouts or spies, came back to Moses and Aaron, the leaders, with the whole Israelite community at Kadesh in the desert of Paran. There they reported to them and to the whole assembly and showed them the fruit of the land, the grapes. They gave Moses this account: "We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey." That's a phrase that meant it's very productive. "Here is its fruit. But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified," meaning they had walls, "and very large. We even saw descendants of Anak there," the really large people, the long-necked people. "The Amalekites live there, live in the Negev, and the Hittites and the Jebusites and Amorites," those were all enemies of Israel, "live in the hill country. And the Canaanites live near the sea and along the Jordan." In other words, there's grapes, but there's no way we can take that land. That's what happened when my brother took the giant shoe into the locker room. No way. No how. Then Caleb, verse 30, silenced the people before Moses and said, "We should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it." Now, Caleb here, and we assume Joshua with him, they're not discouraged or disheartened. They believe that despite the very large warriors, despite the walled cities, they can take the land because they've seen the grapes. And they believe that the grapes are a sign that God's blessing is there. Verse 31, "But the men who had gone up with him said," these are the other 10, "We can't attack those people. They're stronger than we are." And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they had explored. They said, "The land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there of great size. We saw the Nephilim there." The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. "We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." Continuing, Numbers 14. "That night, all the members of the community raised their voices and wept aloud." They're so terrified. "All the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said to them, 'If we only had died in Egypt or in this wilderness, why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? They're going to kill us all. Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt, where there were slaves to Pharaoh?' And they said to each other, 'We should choose a leader and go back to Egypt.'" Now, this is all-out mutiny at this point. The scout team comes back after 40 days. They're carrying the grapes. 10 of the 12 say, "No way, we can't do it." 2 of them, Joshua and Caleb, says, "We should take that land." Verse 5, "Then Moses and Aaron fell face down in front of the whole Israelite assembly gathered there. Joshua, son of Nun, and Caleb, son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had explored the land, tore their clothes." Now, that's an ancient symbol of great grief because people were disobeying God. "And said to the entire Israelite community, 'The land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and will give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will devour them. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them.'" Verse 10, "But the whole assembly talked about stoning them." Okay, now, on your own, you'll want to go read the end of the story. It goes on for a couple of chapters, but I want you to see what's happening here. God had heard the cries of his people under slavery and the bondage 400 years to Pharaoh. Okay, he heard their cries. They're in slavery. He goes to Moses. Remember the scene with the burning bush? He calls Moses to go and confront Pharaoh and say, let my people go. He sends the plagues on Egypt and Pharaoh. He parts the Red Sea. He does miracle after miracle to deliver his people. Now Moses has led them to the brink, a journey of about a year or so, to the brink of the promised land. The spies are sent out to do the reconnaissance mission to get the intel. They see the grapes. They see the wonderful land, but they see the large people. And they come back, 10 of them, and say, no can do. 2 of them, Joshua and Caleb, disagree. They say, no, we can do this. Why? Because God is with us. Because he promised. And then they're shouted down. Not just 2 against 10, now it's 2 against the whole nation. They're shouted down. And then the whole assembly talks about stoning them to death. They can't convince them. Now, if you would read ahead to the end of the story, you'll find out that at this point in time, the people do not listen. They are unwilling to follow Moses. They do not listen to Joshua and Caleb. They don't stone them, but they don't listen, and they're unwilling to go into the land. And God is not happy with them. God says, okay, since you have not trusted me and are not obeying me, none of you will go into the promised land. Not a single one of you except for those 2. And for 40 years, the next 40 years, they wander around in the desert because the whole generation dies off. You don't want the land? You're not going to see it. And fast forward to when the time finally comes, 40 years later, in Joshua chapter 14, the time comes to take the land, and Caleb, who is now 85 years old, says this. I don't have this in your booklet, but you can look it up. Joshua 14, verse 11. I am still as strong today as the day Moses sent me out. I'm just as vigorous to go out to battle now as I was then. Now give me this hill country, the uphill battle against a fortified enemy that the Lord has promised me on that day. You yourself heard then that the Anakites were there, and their cities were large and fortified. But the Lord helping me, I will drive them out just as he said. Here's the way we end today. Joshua and Caleb were willing to fight for 3 reasons. 2 of them I've known about. The 3rd one I didn't see till this time. 3 reasons. First, because they trusted the promise of God. They trusted the promise of God. Secondly, they remembered those grapes. They wanted God's best blessing for their lives. And they knew that even though God's best blessing was at the end of an uphill fight against a fortified enemy, it was worth it. And they were willing to fight. And the 3rd reason, and like I said, I didn't really see it till this time, looking through the lens of the power of spiritual friendship. The 3rd reason they were willing to fight is that they were not alone. This is not one man making a stand against many. This was 2 men standing together. We need each other. The power of spiritual friendship. Here's the questions for your table groups today. First, has your faith in God ever put you in the minority? Have you ever had to defend your faith before those who think your faith is foolish? Secondly, if you had been one of the 12 spies sent to check out that land, what would have been your report and why? See the large warriors, see the walled cities? Are you a more tentative sort, or are you a bolder sort? What would have been your report, and why? Thirdly, Joshua and Caleb believed God's best, those grapes, the symbolic grapes, were worth an uphill struggle against a fortified enemy. How have you found that to be true in your own life? That God's best is worth a struggle uphill against a fortified enemy. All right, get coffee, bring me your prayer requests if you have them, and I'll wrap you up like usual about 6:52.